Hello everybody, Connor McDonald here. Hopefully you can all see me appropriately. As you can tell, I'm just landed in Singapore, and one of the pains of doing any kind of web kind of thing from a hotel room is, of course, hotel rooms are nice and dark, which of course hopefully you can still see me and hear me and everything's okay. But yeah, I'll do my best to light the room. In fact, you can actually see I actually packed a bedside light from home, stuffed that in the suitcase to actually light the room a little bit better. And then we got the laptop and the webcam, etc. So hopefully that will suffice for today's kind of stuff. Hotel rooms are hilarious. Like you get your little sort of custom water bottle all done, but then you get things like this in the bathroom, like, purple water. What on earth is purple water? I assume it's probably good for me. I assume it's probably expensive and going to go on my room bill, but that's okay. That's what expenses are for, and I can see that my manager's on the line, so that'll be his problem, not mine. So let's have a look at what we're going to cover today. Let me find my screen. Questions already received. Hopefully you can see that. So this is what has come in on the AskTOM questions page that's come in on the office hours routine. So I stress you can obviously ask questions as we go in the chat line, but if you want to get ahead of the game and you have things that you just like to spend some time talking about, these are what's come in advance. And so they get priority because these people went to the effort of logging a question. So the questions we have are, we've got a UTL file versus the cloud database. And I'll explain each one as we get to it. How CPU count works with sockets, cores, and threads, and the like. Apex queries are getting slower as we scroll, and how we're going to try to improve upon that. Alter table drop partition hangs, and this one I like. Someone said we unfortunately moved the date to 2023 in our database. Now we've moved it back. The question is, how do we then resolve this problem? And the last one, if I get time, is this is one I wanted to actually do in a previous office hours session, but never got around to it, and that is a bit of a rant on SQL injection. And we had some questions and asked Tom about SQL injection and how people tend to still somewhat what I call trivialize the important issue of SQL injection. So UTL file versus cloud database. And the question that came in, I'll just to elucidate a bit more on what that was someone said, we're migrating to a cloud database system. It doesn't appear that we get to use UTL file, and that's obviously a critical part of this person's requirements. So how do we do it? Well, the answer to that is pretty simple. We actually do get access to UTL file. The question is, in what version of cloud database are you using? So if we flick onto, if you just go to cloud.oracle.com and click on the database link, you can actually see some of the options you get in terms of what are my facilities, what are my various database facilities available to me. So the first one is database cloud service. Now what that is literally a database server running in the Oracle cloud that you pretty much have carte blanche access to. So in that scenario, you can actually get a, for example, secure shell into the actual server itself and actually run UTL file and get access to the file system, etc. Then we've got Exadata Cloud Service and Exadata Cloud at Customer. They're similar offerings, really just changing the location of the server. If you have Exadata Cloud at Customer, it's obviously on your own site, and therefore that solves things like where data has to reside in terms of geography and security and things like that, often to do with government restrictions. And Exadata Cloud Service is really the same as Database Cloud Service, just on incredibly much more powerful and performant gear. Anyone that's running an Exadata machine at the moment will know that they're just so much faster. But the key one is the next two down below. Exadata Express Cloud Service and Database Schema Cloud Service, and the key word there is managed. And what does managed mean? What you're actually doing is you are giving over the responsibilities for the management of that database. Now, that is a very positive thing for customers who, for example, don't have an on-site DBA or don't have a lot of on-site expertise in terms of being able to manage and look after a database. I actually did some work with a client who literally had no Oracle skills whatsoever, and they wanted to run Apex. And so rather than, they started off with Apex on site, just running on a small server, but then the question was, how do we back it up? How do we look after it? What happens if it fails, etc. So that is an obvious candidate for moving to a managed service on a smaller scale. Now, the key thing there is because it's managed, you don't actually get access to the server as such at the operating system level. You get access to the database through various interfaces, the most common one being Apex and potentially REST. So the key thing to remember there is you don't get access to UTL file on those particular managed offerings, simply because even if you did, you would struggle to actually get access to the files. Now, don't get me wrong, access to file, some sort of access to operating system files, I think is actually a pretty cool idea, even in a managed service. Now, what that would require is for us to be able to provide a much more restricted set of what you get access to, how to write to it, etc. Now, all I can suggest is get onto Twitter, get onto your, send a tweet to Oracle Cloud, get onto the forums, etc., and start making these enhancement requests. I think there's potentially an option there to have limited UTL file access. So, for example, it writes to a particular directory somewhere on the server with, say, a particular size cap, and then you might be able to access only that directory and files in that directory with something like SFTP, or from the database with something like DBMS file transfer. So I think the opportunity is there to actually get file level access in a managed service. Currently, we don't provide it, but jump onto the forums, jump onto the feedback lines and make these requests. One of the things that we want to do to make our cloud services more useful for all customers is be able to adapt and improve and enhance them over time to actually suit the needs of customers as they come in. So I encourage people to jump on the forums. There's been people have been saying on Twitter, every time they go onto the Oracle Cloud website, generally they see subtle changes in the UI, enhancements in the UI, and enhancements in the facilities we offer. Sometimes the storage for the same price goes up, etc. So we're constantly evolving, trying to make our cloud services better. So I encourage you to jump on the forums and help us to help you in that respect. Okay, next question. CPU count, cores, sockets, threads, all that kind of stuff. When is 18C Express the free on-site version of 18C? The general consensus with 18C Express or 18C XE is a couple of things. One is, in the past when we had an XE version of 11G, people used to be very, very critical, and I'll happily concede with good reason, that we came out with 11G database. 11C XE took a long time to come out afterwards. And then where was 12XE? Where were patches? Where was anything for XE? It just seemed to languish behind. That wasn't just because we're nasty people. There was actually a legitimate reason for that, and that is workload. XE used to be a totally separately built database. We had Standard Edition, Enterprise Edition, and XE was actually a separate product built internally by Oracle. So you had to build it almost from scratch because it had a lot of restrictions. We had to actually change the actual architecture of how the actual product worked in order to meet our obligations in terms of giving it away for free. That takes time, takes effort, and of course then every time we release a new version of the database, we have to do the same thing. I'll just stare at the screen for this. So that's an inherent problem in the sense that you want to be able to provide a free database, but it's a lot of work to actually build it and actually get it out to customers. And therefore, people are critical of that, and rightly so. With 18C XE, we've simply done away with that. Rather than give you a product which is severely restricted in terms of its functionality, 18C XE will be a complete version of the database. Every single option that's in the Enterprise Edition will be available for you to use and will be there in 18C XE. It is a completely running database. Now, my understanding is, and obviously these things are always variable, is effectively it will be normally somewhere between 1 or 2 release updates after the first release of the database. So 18C came out in January, so I would expect somewhere in the second half of the year 18C XE to come out. Obviously, you can't hold me to that because I'm at a position in the organization where I don't get to make those calls. But that's my gut feel as to where we'll sit, because we do these release updates every 3 months. I would imagine after the second one, we're probably looking at somewhere around the second half of 2018. But the thing that's big for me is because it is fully functioned, it didn't actually take us a lot of work to build it. we simply, we take it as a cut of the full Enterprise Edition product, and all we have to do is then backfit the storage, memory, and CPU restrictions. That's a much smaller amount of work for us to actually put those restrictions in than to actually completely re-engineer the product to turn off things like partitioning and bitmap indexes and et cetera, stuff like that. So the cool thing with 18CXE is not only will it be free, it'll hopefully be fully functioned, and it'll come out on regular intervals in the same way that Enterprise Edition will, because we don't have to do a great deal with Enterprise Edition to turn it into an XE version. So gut feel, as I said, don't hold me to it. My gut feel the second half of the year, but I would imagine as the on-premise versions of 18 come out that you can download, as more platforms come out, once the Linux, Windows, etc. platforms come out, I'd imagine you'd probably see 18CXE following shortly thereafter. So hopefully that'll be super cool. CPU count, sockets, cores, threads, etc. In the good old days, like when I first got started with databases and Oracle and the like, it was pretty simple what happened. You had a CPU and that was it. CPUs were CPUs. They ran terribly, but one CPU, you could get one piece of workload done. If you had 10 CPUs, you could do 10 things at once. It was pretty simple. And then cores came out and hyper-threading and all that kind of stuff, and it all pretty much went downhill roughly from there. Good for performance, not so flash in terms of understanding. In a nutshell, it's complicated. And what I did was I grabbed an AWR report literally from this laptop. I just fired this up and had a quick look at it, and you can see it. The laptop's name is XVS18. In fact, let's shrink down to just the key line that's important. It's Windows, etc. Now, this is a good example. It says we have sockets, 2 cores, and 4 CPUs. Now, it's one of those awkward things where CPUs, I generally think maybe historically as a physical piece of equipment. It's a CPU. I go buy a CPU. You go to a computer shop, you buy a CPU. We don't interpret it that way. What we do is a socket is a physical chip, something that you go buy off the shelf and you jam it into your laptop, desktop, server, etc. That's what we call a socket. Now, on that socket might be the number of cores, the number of things that can actually do work on that chip. And that's what we're looking at doing here. So in this particular machine, on this Dell XPS13, it has 2 cores on the one socket. Now, where does CPUs come in then? In the Oracle speak, we call a CPU as something as the capacity to do work. Now, to help explain that better, I have one socket, it has 2 cores. I have hyper-threading enabled, which effectively lets you do 2 pieces of work at the same time on a single core. Now, when I say 2 pieces of work, that is working on the premise that one thing can't keep a core busy all the time. Very few applications just grab the CPU and say, all I need to do is be on CPU, right? The moment I need to access memory, and obviously even worse is access IO, but anything which is not running right on the actual core itself means that core is now idle and could be utilized doing something else. So we have this concept of sockets, cores, and the capacity to do work. So theoretically, I should be able to do 4 things concurrently on this machine. Now, you and I know that the physics of the matter is I actually only have 2 cores. So if I get 2 things running absolutely 100% flat out on CPU, the third thing actually won't be possible. What we're relying on is the fact that cores don't just do pure CPU work. No one writes an application to calculate the square root of pi over and over and over. We actually do things like access memory, store and retrieve memory, etc. All those things give our ability to actually run some hyper-threading and hopefully get a little bit more throughput. But servers don't work like that nowadays. Nowadays in servers, we have things called vCPUs, where you've got like a virtualization layer sitting on top of your server. So Oracle says, oh, yep, I think I've got 4 CPUs. That might not actually be 4 physical CPUs or 4 cores or anything. It could be something that the virtualization software tells the operating system what it actually has available. I've worked on for example, some machines which have zones, logical domains, and IBM have these things called LPARs. And in all these systems, you don't actually even have to specify physical pieces of machinery. On the IBM, for example, you can say, I want a virtual machine that has 2.7 CPUs. Now, what on earth does that mean? It's 2.7 physical sockets worth of work that you can give to that unit. Even more complicated is you can give ranges. You can say this machine is allowed to have between 2 and 5 CPUs depending on load and depending on what other virtualization or other virtual machines on the same platform might have. So when Oracle says, okay, I'm doing an AWR report or knowing how many CPUs it is, it can only rely on what the OS tells it, and it has to interrogate the OS and ask for that information. And obviously that information could be, well, for lack of a better term, fiction, depending on what the virtualization says to it. And as I said, this under and over provisioning concept, I've worked on places where, for example, we have a machine with 4 physical CPUs, we have 2 VMs on it, and each one's been given 3 CPUs. Now, obviously, if they're both going flat out, you can't make 6 CPUs out of 4 physical CPUs. But the reality is, you might do virtualization like that because one is busy during the day and one's busy during the night, etc. So there's all these things that complicate it. So where does that leave us when it comes to CPU count? What does CPU count actually mean in the initialization parameters? Well, in its simplest form, here's my base recommendation. Don't set CPU count. And I'll explain why. In fact, probably a better way of saying it would be careful if you ever choose to set CPU count. If you don't set it, out of the box, what the database is going to do is it's going to interrogate the operating system and say, what's my CPU count? And the OS will say, you've got 2 cores, they're hyper-threading enabled, 1 socket, etc., like my Windows machine here. That information will be passed back to the database and it'll be used. The problem there, well, not problem, is if you have a resource manager plan set, and most databases will, they'll have it set to default plan. The moment resource manager is active, and it's pretty much active out of the box, and you have CPU count set, what you've in fact enabled is a thing called instance caging. And this is a really cool facility. Instance caging is really, really cool to have. What instance caging lets you do is say, I don't care how much actual physical power my server has, I want my database only to consume a certain amount of it. And in fact, X CPUs worth. Now, just to reinforce the fact that is capacity to do work, not physical sockets. So remember, my machine said it had 4 CPUs. That is, in theory, 4 threads across 2 cores on 1 socket. So 4 threads of work capacity. If I was to set CPU count to 2, effectively what I'm doing is saying my database here is allowed to consume approximately 50% of the box's resources. That's why I say, unless you deliberately want to do instance caging, and don't get me wrong, instance caging is a really, really cool thing to have when you're running multiple databases on the same server, don't set it because you might unknowingly be actually reducing the amount of capacity your box will actually be able to deliver to you. How do you tell if it's actually kicked in and things are going on? You can look at resource consumer group, $, resource consumer group. There's a couple of, it's a massive view. That view is like got 100 columns. But the key ones are CPU wait time and consumed CPU time. If the CPU wait time is non-zero, effectively instance caging is in effect here. We wanted to use some CPU and the database said, no, I'm throttling you back. So hopefully that explains how CPU count relates to those things you'll see on an AWR report. And my general consensus is unless you're running multiple databases on the same box and you want to actually constrain them in some way, you're best off not setting CPU count at all. And understanding the fact that a CPU in Oracle speak is a capacity to do work, not a physical chip that actually sits on the box. Next question, I gotta keep an eye on the time. Oh man, the time just races away. I always think, oh man, we're gonna be finished in 30 minutes, but someone on this line just keeps talking and that'd be me. Queries get slower when scrolling. And this came in to elucidate a bit more, I'm using Apex and I'm using the stock standard paging facilities in Apex, and they're really cool because I don't have to write queries to do it. But as I keep paging down, things get slower and slower and slower. And the question is why? So to do that, I'm going to actually drag out some slides I presented in the Apex Connect conference in Germany a few weeks ago, because they're obviously relevant here. And we'll talk about Apex, but also talk about just paging in general. So here's the requirement. Sorry to jump back and forth on the slides. Employees by hire date, most recent first. Quick guzzle of water. So hopefully everyone on the call is familiar with that this is not the way to do it. Select from employee where row number less than 5, order by hire date descending. There's a reason you shouldn't do that, is because it's wrong. That you can always infer that the query is being processed in the way it's written. First, we do where row number less than 5. So just grab me 5 random rows and then order them by hire date. There's no guarantee that that's actually the 5 most recent hires. It's just 5 random rows and then sorted. And so most of us learned a long time ago back in Oracle 8.1 and onwards that we had to do an inline view, something like this. Order by the hire date first, there in pink. And once you've sorted all the rows, then you can pluck off the first top 5 rows where row number less than 5, and that works. You can use the row number analytic function in inline view as well. You get the same effect. Or in 12C and above, you can use the fetched first 5 rows only syntax, which is the ANSI standard syntax for doing this. Under the covers, we actually just rewrite it to one of the previous SQLs you just saw. Now, this is one of the interesting things where developers who don't use Oracle well often say, well, that's all, I'm not writing inline views, that's all too complicated, especially when we start doing next pages and stuff. Why not just have my application do it? I could do something like this. If I'm writing something, say, in Java, why bother with row nums and inline views? I can just do select from emp table and order by hire date. That gets me all the rows, sorted in top. But obviously, I don't want to show all the rows on the screen. I'll just basically do a fetch the first, for example, in this case, 5 rows. I'm doing result set next, which does a fetch, and simply go put the row out to the screen or the file or wherever it has to go, and then stop after 5 or 10, etc. Job done. Similarly, you might say, who cares? Apex can do it. Same thing. That's what this question was driven by, the fact that why would I bother doing querying deliberately in Apex when I can just use, say it's a paginated result set. Apex is pretty cool. You simply say, I want it paginated, and you get the rows 1 to 5 and the next button, the previous, it's all done for you. Both those options may cause you problems. Now, I know that's, maybe a contentious thing to say because I'm an Oracle person talking about that Apex might have a drama in that respect. Once you start getting into very big result sets, that's where you can get into grief. And so I shouldn't say result sets, result sets. So let's look at a demo. So there's a table on the screen called TX. Hopefully that font is large enough. The actual column names are not particularly interesting, but this is probably the more interesting piece of information. If we query user tables, we can see this table's got, let me look, just over 10 million rows, and it's about 1.5 gigabytes or 1,500 megabytes actually on disk. Now, to work out how much effort it is to actually give the top 10 results, I'm going to use a $V view called $SQL Work Area Histogram. Now, the way that works is, that is actually some information about the total amount of temporary work used to do things like sorting and hash joins across the entire instance. Now, because it's across the entire instance, luckily I'm the only person on the database, but even so, because it's a running total, the only way I can see what a particular query did, we take a snapshot of that before we run the query, then take a snapshot afterwards and compare the differences. So we're going to do that. So I'm going to create a table called query before, which is simply a copy of that V view. That's our snapshot before. Now, this is the good mechanism to actually get a sorted result set. I'm doing select from TX, order by object ID in an inline view where row num less than or equal to 10. It ran in about 6 seconds. It normally runs a bit faster, but obviously we're recording the video and doing a fair bit of work here. So remember, 10 million rows, 1,500 megabytes of rows that we had to actually sort. Let's run a query that shows now the delta between the current and the previous. And it's broken up in a histogram kind of format here. So if we look at low and optimal size, probably let's just work on high optimal size. What we're saying here is that up to a size of 2 megabytes, how many operations did we do? We did 3. That's the delta opt column. In fact, the delta column is the total. So I've highlighted that in yellow. So we used 3 lots of 2 megabytes of RAM. So 6 megabytes. Now, that's pretty impressive, I think, because we had 1,500 megabytes of rows to sort. We have to look at every single row to get the top 10, yet we only had to use 6 megabytes of RAM to do it. That's very cool. When the database knows you only want the top 10, it can use some alternate sorting algorithms to be very, very efficient on memory. Let's now do the same thing, but with a bad query. So I'm once again going to take a query snapshot of $SQL work area histogram. And now this is a bit of PL SQL, which is doing pagination effectively in the app tier. You can see all I'm doing is select star from TX, order by object ID, and then just doing a fetch up to 10 times. I didn't tell the database I only wanted the top 10 rows. I said, do a query order by, and then we'll stop when we finish fetching 10 rows. The first thing we notice is it's about twice as slow. It took 10.5 seconds, not 6 seconds. So that leads us to think that something wasn't great. Let's now look at our delta. There's some big numbers there. So here we did 133 operations, but they're only 4 kilobytes. So that's nothing, we don't really care. We did 18 operations up to 1 megabyte. That's 18 megabytes. So it's already 3 times more than what we had before, but really not such a big deal. 6 operations at 6 megabytes. So now we're up to 36 megabytes, plus the other 18. We're already at 50 megabytes of RAM. And then look at this one. The very last line is 2 gigabytes. Now, notice the delta is not delta opt, it's delta 1. Now, what is delta opt and delta 1? Delta opt is operations that could be done exclusively within memory. Delta 1 is I simply didn't have enough memory to do the operation, so I had to dump it out to disk. I did a 1 pass to disk operation. So when I don't tell the database I want the top 10 rows, I just do an order by and do top 10 fetches. I actually used up 4 gigabytes of disk plus 50 megabytes of RAM. Now, if I've got 1,000 users all connected to the database, all doing that, your database is toast. I don't care how big your server is. You're going to be absolutely smashing that server. So it's very important that you don't do it. Let's go back to our slideshow. So if you let the database know, you get these benefits. So the things you're looking for in your execution plans is you can tell you've got a good query if you see the word stop key or you see the word pushed rank. Hopefully that didn't fly too fast. I'll flick back. So stop key. So I'm zooming as an attendee on my phone. So that's why I'm looking over to my left here so I can see what you guys are seeing. So you've got stop key as sort order by stop key or Windows sort pushed rank. Those keywords are telling you that Oracle is using the much more intelligent sorting algorithm because you've told it I only need a certain number of rows. You get some other benefits as well. I'm just keeping on the time. Am I going to get, yeah, we'll do the other benefits as well. I was ordering by object ID descending to get the top 10 object IDs. I'm going to create an index on that column now. It takes a while because 10 million rows. When I run my good query, it's not even 6 seconds anymore. It's instantaneous. It took 0.01 seconds. Why? The database could take advantage of that index and walk just in a descending fashion. It could simply jump down to the right-hand corner of the index and walk backwards 10 rows to get the top 10 rows because an index is always stored in sorted order. So it's instantaneous. It used that index to actually avoid sorting at all. You can see there's no sort operation in the actual execution plan. If I look at just a standard query where the application is going to fetch 10 rows and I'm just going to do a select to start order by, there's no way we're using that index. We do table access full because the database doesn't know you only want 10 rows. And there's no way it's going to say, I'm going to walk backwards 1 row at a time 10 million times through an index. It's going to be terribly inefficient. I'll do a table access full instead. So you get other benefits. Now the question then is, what about the next page? Now I'm just keeping on the time. Yeah, we'll continue on. Here's my point. There is no next page. It's just like Google. On Google, you get pages 1 to 10. You might press the next page, or typically you'll say, if it's on the first page, I'll do some more criteria. Now you might, that's obviously being a bit facetious. You might actually want to be able to page down at least a few times. It is a new query and people think, well, that's an expensive query per page. And this is the ANSI syntax that we would actually suggest that you would actually use. This is what you see in the documentation. It says you can use the offset command to jump 5 rows and then get rows 6 through 10. My recommendation is you probably want to steer clear of this, because this is the epitome of a query getting slower each time you press next page, because we have to skip a whole bunch of rows and then get the next rows. I'm saying you might want to consider forgetting the offset clause. And there's another reason for that is if I do an offset clause, I'm not taking into account the fact that my table could be changing. To explain, if I've done fetch first 5 rows, that's the rows I would get on screen. If I then say offset 5 and fetch the next 5, that is logically what I was expecting to see. But that is only the case if the table didn't change between the 2 executions of those queries. If someone added a brand new row between pressing page down, I would actually see that set of 5 rows. In fact, we can actually prove this with a quite interesting little demo. Is that being shared? Cool. Oh, in fact, before I jump to Apex, this is the Wi-Fi speed in my hotel room, 200 megabits per second. That is just scary awesome. Anyway, here I have an Apex report. Hopefully you can see large enough on the screen. I can't go much bigger because I need to be able to scroll down as well. And that'll obviously mess up the share. You can see the top value for X is 1099. So this is my query in descending order. So it goes down to 1090, as you can see. So I've got 10 rows on the page. If I press next, I would expect to get to 1089. Press next. Oh, it actually went up by 1, up to 1100. If I go next, it went up to 1101. Like I'm actually getting reverse scrolling even though I'm pressing next page. The reason for that is I've got a background job that's actually busy adding rows to this table. And that's the problem with doing scrolling with the offset clause, is you're assuming a static set of data. So what you might want to consider doing is, rather than just relying on the offset clause, which might give your users somewhat spurious results, when you show them a batch of rows on the screen, you want to remember the value they last saw, in this case, 3rd of December. When you run your next query for the next page, rather than just doing offset, add a predicate where the hire date is less than that last value you saw. And that will guarantee that the next page is then logically consistent with the user. Drop partition hangs. Now, what does that mean? If you're doing alter table drop partition, these are some of the things that might be causing you some problems. It could be a bug. If you go to support.oracle.com, you see there have been some bugs in the past when doing things like dropping partitions, truncating partitions, etc. The detail of this question was, it used to work fine in 11. We have this job that drops old partitions, and now in 12, it seems to run for a long, long time. Now, it could be a bug. So you speak to support. It could be the number of extents. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that the number of extents is a big issue. We've had some interesting scenarios on Oracle support where people have had like hundreds of thousands of extents. And so actually cleaning up that has taken some time. And similarly, we've had some ASSM, automatic acceptance space management bugs, when you get into the hundreds of thousands of extents, even though it's stored in a bitmap and not in the dictionary anymore. So if you've got a massive number of extents, you might start seeing some performance degradations. If you've got a huge number of dependencies on that table, you know, a massive SGA, you could get, for example, huge amounts of parse invalidations or cursor invalidations that are required. All these things might cause a delay. So I can't answer why it might be hanging, right? But I'm going to show you, hopefully, an example of what you want to be doing using this little script. So let's, so we're going to start off with our partition table. Hopefully you can all see that on screen. It's called par. It's a very simple partition table. It's only going to have 1,000 rows in each partition, so it's small. And I've inserted 2,000 rows, 1,000 per partition. So that's the table structure we can see. Now, I'm going to have my alter table drop position hang. So to actually see that, I've set DDO lock timeout to 300. And hopefully, there we go. I can see that I can't drop my partition. It's hanging, right? Now, this isn't some bug I've stumbled onto. I've deliberately architected this way. In fact, how do I see what's going on? Well, I should go into VLL session, and I'll go look for any sessions for where lock weight is not null. That's a session that's blocked. So this guy here, if I flick back and make sure it comes up, you can see he's still stuck. And what's he stuck on? He's stuck on ENQTM contention. Now, this is a manufactured example. what I've got is a background job that has actually got some DML running, an uncommitted DML on a row in partition P1. So if I simply wait for long enough, the job will finish and this partition will actually go. We're not going to wait that long. So, oh, there you go. It's just finished now. So my point is, I can't tell you why a drop partition might hang, but I can give you some clues as to what you want to do if you see anything hanging. Obviously, I just jumped straight into the VDOLOS session for anything with lock weight equals null, and I could see it was a block on trying to get a table level lock. What I'm suggesting you should always do is, first of all, check session events. If you've got something hanging, go straight and see what it's hanging on immediately. If it's something like ENQ TM contention, then you've got some other session that's actually got some sort of exclusive lock on the dictionary level on that particular table or the petition, etc. If that doesn't help, then look at enabling a trace on the session that is hung. Even if it's already hung, you can actually do DBMS monitor session trace enable and turn it on. The reason I say that is sometimes something will look like it's hung, but it's actually just really busy. It might, one of the things you'll see sometimes when you do any kind of DDL on a default database, there's a whole lot of DDL triggers on the supplied schemas like context sys, ord sys, spatial, etc., text indexes. There's DDL triggers throughout the database that fire when you do a drop or a truncate on any object, just in case it impacted, say, something with a text index or something with spatial, etc. So by putting a trace on, even if the thing has already started, you might be able to pick up the particular statement it's either stuck on, or if there are literally hundreds or thousands of statements all busily doing work. Those things give you good ammunition to then bucket that up and send it off to Oracle support to ask us for, well, why is this, and what are some of the mitigations we can look at to actually fix things up. So hopefully that helps, not on why a drop petition might help, but how to actually investigate it and find out why. Okay, this one, I must concede, I had both empathy and a bit of a chuckle at this one. We had a question come in saying, we mistakenly had a routine that set our date forward to 2023. Now we've set the date back, but we're having problems with our control files. And we'll talk about why that could be the case now. So before we talk about controls files, here's the biggest obstacle in my view. If I've set my date forward to 2023 and something that I've actually allowed transactions to occur in my database, there's a very, very good chance that I've got data in my database that's now been date stamped with 2023. That, I would imagine, is priority number one. That's a big drama because you've got data corruption. Let's assume you've managed to correct that. Either undo it, update it, change it to what it was meant to be, etc. Let's say you managed to do that. You still could be in a giant mess. Here's number one. Control files could be in a big mess because if you're using, for example, Recovery Manager, in fact, even if you're using Recovery Manager, then we store information about the database inside the control files potentially. We might be using an RMAN catalog, but let's assume we're not. So information about the archive logs and what the age of the database and how long we should keep things, obviously these things are all date stamped information. So now in your control files, you've got things saying, okay, I've got an archive log that occurred in 2023. So, when does it become redundant? When should it be aged out? How many records should I keep now that the data has been set back to 2017? Do I simply keep adding entries to the control file such that I will fill in the gaps up to these entries that existed for 2023? You've got a bit of a mess in there. You might have a standby database. How a standby is protected? Well, the archive logs are obviously transmit over, so you might have data corruption in the standby. But obviously, the other thing is the synchronization of the standby is controlled with information, once again, partly coming from the control files, which may have been corrupted. And of course, what relies on all this information is RMAN and your RMAN catalog. Once again, you got, I suppose my point is you might have corruption, not just in the data, but in all the incendiary stuff that sits around, or the incidentals that sit around your database that actually let you manage it, back it up, restore it, etc. So how do we fix this? Number one, before you do anything, before you rely on what anyone AskTOM office hours says, is you speak to support, right? Most super important, because the reality is, even if your data is fine, you may have potentially made a giant mishmash of your database, and it could be what I call a sleeper problem. And a sleeper problem being, you might not notice until 6 months down the track and you need to do a recovery and it says, I can't recover because I've got dodgy records in the control file. Or records that needed to be in the control file got aged out because I found some other stuff dated 2023. So super, super important that you speak to support first. And then plan a strategy, go back to support, ratify it with them, etc. Super important that you've got a strategy to move forward and be able to recover from or back out if it all goes wrong. Now, assuming you've done all those things, did I stress that enough? You've done all these things first. This is a rough guide as to what I think you will need to do. Number one is you need to isolate the primary. And what I mean by that is, if you've got, for example, a standby and an RMAN catalog, etc., then doing anything on the primary, right, could cause grief. For example, even simply shutting down the primary to do some sort of action. Well, if you've got, for example, say failover enabled, you go to shut the database down and guess what? It fails over to say the standby. And normally a failover will do a shutdown abort, and that's the last thing you want to do because you've now got a fuzzy database and potentially corrupt control files. So you want to be able to do a shutdown, nicely. So if you're running, for example, data guard monitor, data guard control, make sure you turn off any kind of failover, etc. If you're running OS level clusterware stuff, turn off all the failover stuff so your database is nice and isolated. Get rid of that. Unregister the database from RMAN, etc. Because to get a clean control file, what you want to do is back up the control file to trace, clean shut down your database. It's got to be clean because you need to keep those online ready logs and those archive logs pristine. Otherwise, if you do have a standby database, when you start this database up again, you're going to have trouble you might have to reinstantiate the database fully. That's a big drama. So clean shutdown. Whenever you do a backup control file to trace, you get several versions of that in the trace file. You want the one which is basically reusing the database and having a no reset logs, because you don't want to do any kind of reset log operations because you're going to wipe out your online reader logs and you're probably going to have to reinstantiate your standby. So the way it works is, if you look at and I haven't got one present here, if you look at a control file backup to trace, it has a recreate control file, then it has all the steps to reassociate, re-register log files and archive log files and information, metadata about your backups into the control file. So you can go through and piecemeal select the ones which are important. You might want all of them, you might want some, you might want to get rid of the ones for 2023, etc. Or you might want to get rid of them, all of them, and do a fresh backup immediately you restart. But you can selectively choose what you want to put back in there, and then you're going to recreate the control file with the no reset logs and then issue a recover database. The recover database should do nothing because you did a clean shutdown. You now should have a primary database back up and running with a cleansed control file. You can then re-register the backups in the control file, re-register the archives. Once you've done that, you can then re-register in your RMAN catalog, should you have one, and it will pick up the information from the control file that you've just re-registered, and your database should be back in sync with your RMAN catalog as well. And only then would you then reactivate the standby. The standby should see the information in the control file being correct. It should see that the database was clean, shut down, no recovery was needed, and should just pick up where it left off. Now, that's all nice, easy hand waving. Did I mention you do none of this before you speak to support? Super critical. I think we will get to, we have 8 minutes left, and I think we will get to this, and we might get to the question that came in on the chat line as well. This is my last one on the questions that came in beforehand, which is SQL injection. And the reason I want to talk about it is due to an AskTOM question that came in. Now, the key thing there is someone said, I'm having a problem. I've got a routine where someone can pass in a where clause, and then I want to dump those rows out to a file. So we can actually see, they said, this is what I'm doing, this is my routine, and they were having problems that didn't compile. Now, I responded to them with this. I said, this is what your problem is. And you can see in the red arrow, the SQL they were generating was select star from emp, where high date greater than, and it had a date string, but it wasn't surrounded by to date or quotes or anything like that. And so that's invalid SQL. And that's why their actual routine was failing. And I said, yeah, you're not building a valid query. You want to do something like this. And I gave them an example where we actually had, the correct to-date command, et cetera, et cetera. So we're generating literals, et cetera. And you can see the third arrow there, that is the SQL that will be generated. And then I said, this is the key thing. Search this site for SQL injection. In fact, search Google, search any web support engine for SQL injection, because as you can see, what this person is generating is a SQL statement where part of it is being passed in by the end user, by a random source. That is SQL injection in a nutshell. Why am I having a rant about it? Because we all know this stuff. This is what really upset me. Someone said, please rewrite your example to avoid injection. Don't just put a link in, just rewrite this 3 lines above in your answer. And this is why I wanted to talk about it briefly, and I might be preaching to the converted here, I hope so. There is no such thing as a 3-line answer to SQL injection, right? That doesn't make sense. SQL injection is a big topic that all DBAs, hence DBA office hours, should be absolutely fluent in. There are so many opportunities for SQL injection, not just trivial ones like this where people are building up queries. You can even change your NLS sessions to achieve SQL injection if you're not careful. There's so many ways of doing it. And it's such a, it's still the #1 hacking means that people use. You look at, various surveys each year, SQL injection is the #1 way that people get hacked. So I replied, with this, go to this URL, which actually is a big long discussion about SQL injection. And even said, please don't put a link. A link is exactly what is required for this person. Not a fix to that particular problem, but a good firm grasp of SQL injection entirely. Now, we have 5 minutes left and I've covered all my topics, which is awesome. So in the chat line, let me bring it up again. Where are we? Okay. A question that came in was, we are getting serialized query going for parallel execution in Oracle 12c. I'm going to make some assumptions there about what that actually means. Let me stop the share so you can continue a lovely view of my hotel room. Afterwards, I'll show you a view out the window. So I'm assuming from that what we're saying is we're getting, I'm doing an explicit parallel query hint, something like that, or a table is set as parallel. I run the query and it gets done in serial in 12c. There are, unfortunately, a myriad of options as to why that could be the case. Obviously, initialization parameters are the most obvious candidate. We have things like, if your parallel max service is set to a certain amount of level, or CPU count, for example, if there's not many CPUs, the database may decide you can't run parallel. Resource manager can turn off parallel query. Resource manager can actually prohibit parallel query for a particular session, user group, consumer group, etc. I think by default in 12c, we have automatic degree of parallelism turned on. And so what that means is the database will make a call as to whether it should do parallel or not. And it'll base that on how many CPUs available, what is the current load on the system, how many other parallel queries are going on. If you actually don't have many CPUs, it might not even bother. I've been bitten by that myself in the sense that when I'm trying to do demos of parallel stuff on this Dell, it simply says, no, you're not allowed to do it because you've only got one socket. Why would I bother doing parallel? But as you can see, there's a whole stack of reasons why it might be disabled. Normally, if you do an execution plan, the notes section should tell you why. If it's DML, obviously, you only get parallel DML if you do explicit alter session enabled parallel DML. So that just about covers it for today. I'll put up the standard marketing slide. So hopefully you will follow me on Twitter. You'll reach out to me on YouTube. I just published some videos, or follow me on my blog. Thank you very much for your time, everyone. Unfortunately, it's not as entertaining, hopefully, as it used to be when I had several webcams at home and we have much better lighting. But that's the best we could do in terms of hotel room work. And yeah, as promised, let me give you one last thing. Maybe it's just going to be a reflection of me, but that's the view outside the window, 17 floors up in Singapore. I'm actually in Singapore for Oracle Code. So if you're in Singapore, check out Oracle Code. We'll be doing some interviews online. So keep an eye on the Twitter feed on the Oracle Devs channel. I'll be doing some interviews at Oracle Code on Thursday to actually do some live interviews with people, and we'll share with them what they're doing in their talks, etc. Thank you very much for coming, everyone. And yeah, we'll see you in a month's time. Enjoy the rest of your evening. I'm going to order some room service. Yeah. See you later, guys.